Hello and welcome to the groundbreaking Trauma docuseries where we explore the healing power deep within us. I'm Nick Polizzi, founder of The Sacred Science and co-founder of Whole TV.
And I'm Dr. Pedram Shojai, the Urban Monk, and the other Whole TV co-founder. Thank you for joining us.
Last episode, we explored physical trauma, from shocking and sometimes violent events to the lingering effects of chronic pain. If it hurts, that may be a symptom of trauma, whether it's physical, emotional, big T, little t, or maybe undiscovered. The symptoms of trauma can manifest both physically and mentally.
And if left unchecked, your trauma can dictate your entire life. The greatest joy I'm getting from this series is the courage of our storytellers and the privilege of witnessing their growth. Some of them are still on this journey, but the biggest and hardest first steps are behind them, and it all started with a choice. Nick, please tell us about the continuing and new stories we're featuring today on physical trauma.
Today, we're going to hear more from Jenny, whose chronic pain from the physical trauma of Lyme disease caused her to lose her entire sense of self. We'll also hear powerful testimony from Patricia and Julie, women with life-changing stories to tell about the physical trauma they endured. Despite their vastly different experiences, they both share how physical violations impacted not just their bodies, but their minds and their entire identity. We hope you find this segment as enlightening as we do.
When I was really sick, I got to a very low point in life. I just didn't want to live anymore. I just felt like I had lost everything that I had ever wanted. And I've always been such a positive person. Like, everyone that knows me is like, Jenny who loves life, right? Like, I just love to love everything. And I had gotten to this point where, like, mindfulness and meditation and positive thoughts, like, none of that was working for me. I remember this one day where I was just I just crawled up in a ball under my covers, and I just really wanted out. And my husband was trying to help me feel better, and he was talking to me, and he was like, you just need to be positive, you can do this. And I was like, no, I've tried. I've been trying for years. It's not working. Like, I've gone beyond the point where you can return.
Trauma is an experience or a set of experiences, or it could be long-term, where there's a sense of imminent danger. It alters your body and your brain, and really trauma is also about how your body and brain responds to that situation or long-term situations.
This definition has been shifting in the world of trauma around an experience or series of experiences that overwhelms our capacity to cope. And it's the subjective experience of that. And it's not, therefore, reliant on an objective observer to say whether or not that was, traumatic, is that it's my experience.
I had a realization. There's two options. I can continue thinking the thoughts that I'm thinking that were really overwhelming and scary, that this amazing life that I knew I was going to have was done at the ripe old age of 27 or 28. Or I could do something different, and I knew that thinking positive wasn't working. I knew that, like, mindfulness wasn't working for me. It was like I was in too dark of a spot. So the one thing that I just figured out that I could do, which sounds ridiculously simple, but it's what brought me out of this, was to be unbelievably present with myself. Not present with my thoughts, necessarily, kind of, but it was more like I couldn't allow my thoughts to go down those paths and those stories because it would happen in a split second. So I had to stay focused on, if I was drinking a glass of water, for example, I would literally tell myself, I'm drinking water, I'm drinking water, I'm drinking water. I mean, it was so insanely present and simple. If I was walking to the bathroom, I'm walking to the bathroom. If I was lying in bed, I'm lying in bed. I feel the, soft covers. I feel the pillow, really focusing on the sensations of our body and having my thoughts go to that. it took up all the room so that there wasn't space for these wily, crazy stories to take place. And I had to do that for a couple of weeks every day, just having the thoughts be about the actions that I was taking. If this is how much space we have in our mind for our thoughts, right? If we can fill them with, maybe we don't feel accessible to having these positive statements and these positive affirmations, which are very powerful, but sometimes we get to a point where those don't feel accessible or like something authentically that we can do. So how can we fill up that space with something other than the negative thoughts, the scary thoughts, the thoughts that, really cause more trauma in the body?
After someone experiences a major physical trauma in their life, where they feel overwhelmed with sadness, hopelessness, maybe pain, what would be your advice or words of wisdom to help them out of the dark place they might be in?
There is healing. And the good news is that there's a part of us inside, who we are, our essence, our soul, that wasn't damaged. It went underground, this part of us, this beautiful, radiant part of us went underground. And you might not know that it's there, and that's part of the healing process, is to rediscover that beautiful part of each of us that's there, and to realize I'm not bad, I'm not wrong, I'm not horrible, I'm this beautiful soul. And so we have to be able to turn to a higher source of information that's here for all of us. And that's where the healing comes from. There is no healing without access to that higher source of love and compassion.
In order for us to fully heal, we have, from a physical manifestation, from a physical health ailment, we have to support the nervous system. In order to heal from a mental and emotional traumatic experience, we have to heal the nervous system. Simply being able to breathe deeply allows us to do that. And for me, trying guided meditations, if that's something you're interested in, because my mind was like all over the place. I couldn't sit quietly and just focus on my breath. Finding a guided meditation that gives something for my mind to hook onto and follow was the entry point to meditation and mindfulness. And that has brought me across the world many times, going through incredible processes and journeys and meditations that have been unbelievably healing, to the point that there is no question, no denying that our thoughts absolutely create and manifest physical illness, symptoms, conditions in our body.
About 5 years ago, a friend of mine who is a therapist sent me in an email, "Hey, Jarena, have you seen this study?" And, I was in academia, I was at Stanford at the time, and, I just saw the title of the study about adverse childhood experiences and read the abstract. And this study, which was a landmark study with over 9,000 participants within the Kaiser Permanente database, so, middle-class families. And what it discovered was that people who had experienced adverse events in childhood of household dysfunction, specifically household dysfunction, so neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, having someone with a mental illness in the household, a household member who's incarcerated, that these experiences increase our chance of having heart disease and stroke and immune diseases, in addition to smoking, depression, suicidality. And this study, when I started to read it, was the hinge pin for the fact that stress and adversity affects our health and well-being.
You've had quite a journey with your own personal story of trauma. Would you feel comfortable sharing some of your story?
Really, my healing began at the age of 16. I had a child that was taken from me through the Mormon Church. And when my son turned 18, he came back to live with me. And all of a sudden, my trauma was sitting in my living room.
I had, my pregnancy was about 13 years ago, and I had a wonderful 9 months pregnancy. I was very fortunate. I was teaching meditation at that time. I was going to meditation retreats. I was eating healthily. I had a tremendous amount of support from my friends. So it was a beautiful 9 months, and I'd planned this wonderful natural birth at the hospital because of my age. I just wanted to be really safe, and it was going to be a water birth. There was a doula and a midwife, and so I was very excited, no drugs. And the evening of her birth, I was sitting on the balcony because I was pretty sure I was about to stop my contractions. I could sense her coming. And I'd stayed very connected to my baby, you know, all through the 9 months. And as I sat there meditating, I heard, "I'm dying."
It was at that time I started having nightmares every night. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't understand what was coming forth for me. And I thought, on one hand, that I was going crazy. And these behaviors of numbing out, drinking, you know, the occasional pill popping began as the intensity of the memories started coming back. And some of those included being raped, being beaten, being shaken so violently as a baby that I would pass out. And one night, I got down on my hands and knees, and for the first time probably in my life, prayed to God, if I am going crazy, take my life or show me a path to healing.
There are symptoms such as anxiety. I mean, there's so much anxiety and depression in our culture, and one of the main reasons is childhood abuse. But very often people don't remember. That's one of the problems. You know, they may have been physically abused, sexually abused, they may have been neglected, but they don't remember because as children, we can't tolerate those big feelings of the loneliness, the heartbreak, the helplessness over ourselves, the grief over being treated so unlovingly. And so because we can't handle it as little children, we learn to go up in our head. We learn to disconnect from the body and go up in our head and repress the memories. And little children, many of them have the ability to just leave their body. They just leave, and then they don't know it's been done to them. But what's showing up is anxiety and depression and deep feelings of shame and unworthiness and not being able to deal with their addictions and troubled relationships, not being able to be in a relationship. There's so many different symptoms that show up. I mean, there's so many forms of unhappiness. And so often people have no idea.
And I didn't doubt myself when I heard that. And I say heard, you know, it's some kind of psychic sense, whether it was actually words or just an intuitive knowing. But that it felt like that's what I heard. And so, of course, I woke my family up and we went straight to the emergency room. And sure enough, when they put the heart monitor on my belly, there was no heartbeat.
And it was at that time that I started calling trauma centers in LA, and at 2:00 in the morning, someone picked up the phone. And they just so happened to have a bed available. And I'm like, I am coming. I don't know how long. I don't know what's going on with me, but I'm pretty sure I'm going crazy. This can't be real. And so as I got there, I slowly started unpacking the memories of my childhood, the years of abuse that I had disassociated, the years of abuse that I no longer had memories of. And slowly that journey began of unpacking the magnitude of what had happened to me as a child.
And it seemed within moments the whole emergency team was there in the room, you know, letting me know I needed to have an emergency C-section to save my baby's life. So I immediately let go of any preconceived notions or ideas of how I would have liked to give birth. And I just stayed connected with my baby and said, if you're meant to stay, please stay. You know, and over the next hours, they gave me an epidural. They did the emergency C-section. And as I was lying there, staying in connection with her, I could hear them, the doctors, the nurses saying, oh, she's tangled, we can't get her. And then I hear, oh, she's deep blue. I just kept breathing. I just kept in contact with my baby and just kept letting go, stay calm, stay relaxed, stay connected to this beautiful infant that's inside of me on her way out.
I've worked with people who were traumatized at birth, not because their parents were abusing them, but because they couldn't get out of the birth canal, and it was a long labor, and then they had a C-section. And it takes away their sense of agency. It makes them feel trapped. They are afraid they can't get back to something safe. And so it can have a lot of effects, and I've worked with that. And then I've worked with trauma, for example, that people don't think is traumatizing, but I've worked with so many people who were left by their parents, like at 1 or 2 or 3 with a grandparent, and then they didn't see their parents again until they were, say, 7 or 8. And even though the grandparent might have been loving, it's very traumatic to be left, to be torn away like that.
So with birth, the way we approach birth in Western society is that almost like you're a patient and it's abnormal. But birth is the most normal thing of being a human, right? And we have to do it in order to live on this earth. So lots of people have birth trauma, I believe, and don't realize it. The C-sections are very high in this country, higher than they should be. And that's a major surgery, and that can be very traumatic, especially if the mom, who we call the patient, isn't being treated like she's having a baby and people are talking about golf or the last weekend, or just, not really acknowledging her as a human being, or the family, or the baby. Even the baby who's being born, there's a lot of research that suggests they know what's going on and they can tell if they're being talked about or talked to. And there's also moments where, there is near-death experiences in childbirth, and we unfortunately in the United States have a high mortality rate for mothers, way higher than it should be compared to other nations. So there's times where there's trauma where there's a near-death experience, or the baby almost dies, or sometimes there's an emergency C-section. All of those things can be traumatic if it doesn't go to plan and it feels like there's imminent danger.
And then, of course, there's neglect, which has proven to be one of the biggest traumas, even more than physical abuse, is neglect. And that's why they put prisoners in isolation, because that's hugely traumatizing. We are social beings. And when we're neglected, like so many kids are, they're just put in their room, or they're put in a basement, or they're left alone. They're not tended to. They're not fed well. Nobody cares about their feelings. They just grow up feeling like they don't matter at all.
So after you went to a trauma center and unpacked the trauma suffered in your childhood, what were some of the next steps that you took?
After that, I decided I'm going to cut out anything in my life that possibly could affect me emotionally. That was alcohol, caffeine, anything, and just really take the deep dive into my healing. And what I didn't expect from there was to go through this process of having memories flood me back. It was as if all of a sudden having my son come back and be in my home with me cracked me open neurologically in ways I never anticipated, ways I never thought were possible. And then at the time, I started asking the universe, there has to be a way that I can open to my healing. There has to be a way for me to get through this, because every day, even after the memories started coming back, I prayed that I would die. How do you possibly live with the reality for 13 years of your life you were sexually abused by family members? How do you live with the people that were supposed to care for you would beat you relentlessly year after year, day after day, night after night?
And then, of course, there's physical and sexual abuse, outright physical and sexual abuse, which is, I'm sure everybody knows, is deeply, deeply traumatizing. It just takes away, again, any sense of self. And the child feels so helpless. And this is one of the hardest feelings to feel, is helpless over what's happening to you or helpless over what somebody else is doing to you. And then later in life, the feeling of helplessness is so terrifying, feels like life and death to the person, that they'll do almost anything to avoid it. And so it leads to many addictions. It leads to not only substance addictions and addictions to activities, like pornography, but also addictions to people, like somebody else has to make you feel like you're okay because you don't know how to do that for yourself.
It's hard because it's your family. It's people before my memories came back that I had a close and meaningful relationship with. And they're people that brought you into this world and also are on, as I like to call it, our spiritual journeys and our spiritual curriculums. And this was mine and that was theirs for all of us to learn and grow and evolve. And there's so many things that have made me a better human being having gone through what I have. And yet the humanness remains of, can you forgive? Can you let go? Can you come into resonance and acceptance? That's something I'm still in the process of going through.
Unfortunately, stories like Patricia's are more prevalent than we know. Many victims of such intense childhood abuse don't even remember their trauma until they're faced with external symptoms. After decades of disconnecting the body from the mind, it takes bravery and a deep commitment to face your trauma and confront it. Let's take a look at some key takeaways. Stress and adversity affects our well-being. Physical trauma alters how our body and brain respond to the world. Negative thoughts can manifest physical illness in our bodies. In order to heal, you must support the nervous system. Our environment has a profound effect on our health. A traumatic birth can lead to physical and mental problems for the mother or the child. There's always a chance to heal. Love, compassion, a strong desire to heal all have proved to be effective medicine. A person's beauty and worth are defined by many things. Discover those things in yourself and celebrate them.
I hope you're appreciating this material. We're going to pick back up in a second, but at first, I want to take a moment to tell you how you can access the entire trauma series on Whole TV. Below this video, you're going to find a link to the full docuseries, as well as a vast library of other health and wellness content. This includes several powerful bonus materials that you could bring into your home at a special discounted price, including the uncut footage of these interviews. It includes the Trauma Companion Guidebook that's packed with powerful takeaways and action items from each episode. We're taking deep dive comprehensive wisdom here that's not included in what you're seeing in these episodes. We just couldn't fit it all in. On top of that, you're going to be invited to exclusive live stream events that we'll be hosting where you can ask questions directly to some of the renowned experts you see in these episodes. So if you're interested in bringing these powerful healing solutions into your life, it's well worth checking out. If our bodies are like well-oiled machines, then our brain is the supercomputer that keeps it all running. Of course, there's a variety of makes and models, but for the most part, we all come off the factory floor with the same preset program: survival.
But what's a computer without glitches?
Don't get me started. Our supercomputers require maintenance to perform properly, but the mind is also constantly upgrading itself. Our experiences encode our brains and our entire body. So what happens when we experience a physical trauma? We get the glitch.
Physical trauma, especially in childhood, can actually change a person's brain structure. This can contribute to long-term behavioral issues and physical health problems. This deep-seated trauma can lead to the abuse of sex, drugs, alcohol, and an unconscious attraction to unhealthy or abusive relationships. In cases that involve childhood trauma, these poor decisions are made on an unconscious level. Victims of childhood abuse suppress their memories in order to survive, but the brain and body doesn't forget. It might be difficult to identify and confront the traumas that we experience in our adult lives, but it's even harder to do so with childhood trauma, especially if you don't even know it exists. Here's Pedram to shine a light on early physical trauma, which is often not easy to see.
Survivors of childhood abuse have had decades for their brains and bodies to accept and adapt to their trauma. The pain we experience as a child gets encoded into that supercomputer, and it dictates every decision we make for the rest of our lives. As we're about to see, one of the great keys to unlocking childhood trauma and reprogramming the mind and body is love.
So trauma is anything that occurs that is too fast or too much or too quick for us to be able to assimilate, and we enter maybe into a state of overwhelm. And if we don't calm down or come back to a certain place of our own equilibrium or homeostasis in our body, then we may have trauma encode within our system.
You know, my memories weren't back of what had happened to me. And so in my 20s, I went through this period of, I could use men like we hear men using women. I was this person that men didn't really understand. How can she have sex with me and not want to call me again, right? This interesting dynamic. And to me, it was so disposable. It was a way to have power. It was a way to control. And I went through years of being promiscuous. I had no attachment to my body. My head was detached from my body. There was no connection at all.
Sometimes these experiences occur, and because of the nature of trauma, there's a dissociative experience where that piece of what happened gets pushed down. And we manage to cope and go through life, but we're constantly trying to push this away. These feelings, these memories could be flashbacks. And so often people may not be aware of what they're pushing away, but they engage in behaviors that are, trying to distract them from this, what's so deep and painful inside. And so they may seek out substance abuse, or they may be workaholics. They may have tumultuous relationships because every time somebody comes close, they push away because they're so afraid of being betrayed and hurt again. So it can show up in lots of different ways through school or work or recreational substance abuse or substance use and abuse, and our relationships, that people and an underlying sense of anxiety or fearfulness or self-worth, that people feel this real sense of self-deprecation and self-loathing, and they don't know why. They just know that they hate themselves.
You had so much physical and sexual abuse happen to you. It must have been really so overwhelming to just wrap your brain around. How does a person, or you, put one foot forward when you started to remember all of your trauma?
I think what was unexpected for me, and one of the things in trauma that we don't really discuss, is that this disassociation that happens where your memories become blocked. And I think I had fear in going in, but I've always been a courageous warrior of, if it's something I need to face, I'm going to face it. What I didn't expect in going into it were all the pieces that I didn't have memories of. To hold the sheets as I lay there recounting what had happened, the years and memories that had been suppressed. And I think that's what was unexpected, but it finally made my life make sense.
what happens with people who have been abused is they pick up right where the abusers left off. You know, they put themselves down. They judge themselves harshly. They have to be perfect. They can't make any mistakes. They can't fail. They cut themselves. They harm themselves in so many ways. They eat poorly. They make themselves sick. They get grossly overweight, obese. There's so many ways that they're abandoning themselves. So they're picking up right where the abusers left off.
When my memories of my abuse started coming back, I thought, oh my God, I will never be loved. Who would ever love me? There is no way that I would ever meet someone that could love me through having had this happen. If people know the truth about me, I'm a fraud. I've been found out. You know, what would happen? And I went through that pain and suffering of all the pretty picture that I had painted for myself up until then of being successful and perfect and polished. And, you know, if I hold my fork just right, no one will know. And all of a sudden, that image was shattered. And my only thought was, how do I die? And so day after day, I planned, okay, if I hang myself from this rafter over here and my partner comes home, he won't see me right when he gets there. You know, that'll save him a little bit. Day after day, I planned, how could I die? And not, you know, the day before I went into treatment and I was on my hands and knees praying to God. I had drank, I don't know how many bottles of wine and taken pills. And although my intent at the moment wasn't suicide, unconsciously, I think I was on the verge of it. And I think it's something that we do have to address. What are we all hiding from? What are the secrets that we're keeping that are keeping us sick?
We've heard that birth trauma can have major effects on the mother and the baby. You must have been so scared when you heard the doctors talking about your baby. I mean, how did you get through this experience?
When they did pull her out, they suctioned her really quickly, and then you hear my voice. I videotaped this, or I had somebody videotape it, and I just looked at it about a year ago. But you hear me in this very authoritative voice saying, put my baby on me. And they listened to me, and they did. They put her on my belly, and she immediately went to my breast and began nursing. So it's just a beautiful miracle. And then they cleaned her up a little bit. But I wouldn't let them, the nurses and the doctors, take her away from me for a period of time, any period of time. And the reason I did this is I understand about trauma and how a traumatic event can embed in our bodies. Now, coming into the world entangled with death, if you will, is a very traumatic event. And so I wanted to do my best to not allow my baby to become traumatized by this. So I held her, and I cooed to her, and I thoosed her, and I stayed attentive to her probably for about 3 or 4 years, aware of the fact that her entrance into this world and into this body was a very traumatic one. And it was my job as her mother to create safety in her body so she would fully connate, and to safety in her environment in the world so that traumatic event at birth didn't encode in her body and brain.
I work with a lot of individuals who have a history of birth trauma. And what happens is, and how do we know that? How do we know people have birth trauma? So we have information from mothers that their children had traumatic births. How do I know, besides a parent telling me that there's an impact on the brain and body from birth trauma? We do QEEG brain maps, and you're able to see injuries to the brain that people sustain at birth. You don't have to guess there's an impact. You can see it. You can see it with a child. You can see it 50 years later on a QEEG brain map. And that impact of a birth trauma, from the physical impact, the emotional impact, can have a lifetime effect, not just on cognitive functioning, but emotional functioning and the nervous system stays in an overactivated state. Many kids who have birth trauma don't sleep properly, don't eat properly. Moms becoming very agitated and stressed. This becomes a family trauma when a baby comes into the world that isn't regulated. And these kids often lead a life struggling with self-regulation in behavioral areas, emotional areas, social areas. So the good news is that we're better able to identify these children and get them support early and reverse those issues that come up.
I was just speaking with a colleague of mine. I was interviewing her actually for a book that I was writing, and she had a similar birth to my daughter, except this was 40-something years ago, actually about 50 years ago. So she had an emergency C-section. The cord was around her neck, the same as my daughter. I don't think I mentioned that. So she was, experiencing this dying, if you will, not being able to breathe, choking as she was being born. And her mom, for whatever reasons, didn't have the information, the understanding, or the knowledge that I had around trauma and the importance of connecting and healing any traumatic event in the moment, in the days, months, weeks following that traumatic event. So she spent about 40 years of her life experiencing profound anxiety and really not understanding why. And it was in her mid-40s when she went through some trauma. She was actually a trauma therapist, but when she went through some trauma work herself, she got to the core of the issue and traced it back to her birth, where she had this very, very traumatic experience. She was taken away from her mom. Her mom was in a high anxiety state. And the high anxiety of the mom then also transmits into the infant and creates more anxiety for the infant who's already just gone through this probably life-threatening and terrifying experience. And all of that became encoded as implicit memory in her body and lasted 40-something years and gave her a very difficult, disconnected from her body and emotion life.
Being held with love by somebody who has no agenda with you, no attachment to anything, but just becomes a vessel of love for you is extremely healing. And when I work with people in my intensives who have had trauma or who are remembering it for the first time, we always hold them through it to create a safe space. It's just too painful to manage alone, and nobody needs to manage it alone. We're not meant to manage it alone.
I would imagine all parents are very loving and want to give the best to their child, but life is continually happening in the environment around us, or parents may be carrying their own trauma and have difficulty really being able to connect fully and calmly to their child. They may suffer from all kinds of stress or just the busyness of life, or maybe a parent dies. All kinds of events can happen that prevent parents from being as fully present and connected to their child or children as they'd like to be. Just because parents are extremely loving doesn't mean that child isn't going to somehow become traumatized. We want to be really conscious about how we are around our children and how we are connecting to them, how our own feeling and bodily states are, being very aware that that can transmit either from a mother into the fetus or as a mother or father into infants or young children.
Something that I also don't want to dismiss is that in my adult life, I also had this tendency to attract abuse again. When I was 23, I was gang raped by 6 men. And that energy that I brought towards me because I hadn't healed what had happened to me, and yet I could go through that and almost shrug it off as if that was normal behavior and it was okay. What I had gone through, the things I did to myself, not to mention the things that others did to me, was a hard time. And I think, too, the years of abusing alcohol just to numb, realizing at one point in my life that I had never had sex sober. And when I had that aha of, oh my God, every time before I'm intimate with someone, I have to become numb. and the disassociation that would come with that, and the partners that I had along the way. I can't count how many times I pointed the finger. If you were just better, we would be okay. If something, there's something wrong with you, and having no idea. I mean, finally I dated someone who loved me enough to say to me, Trish, I think you've been sexually abused. I think something happened, and I love you enough to help you heal this and to hold space for my coming undone.
We know that everyone has a story and no one comes out of childhood unscathed. Can you tell us about your experience and how you have come to understand your past and how that led to other traumas in your life?
So I was born in Washington, D.C., and my parents, you could say they're very progressive, and they also met in the Peace Corps. So they met in the 60s in the Peace Corps when it was really just starting out in Africa, in Liberia. And they just wanted to travel. My dad was an anthropologist, and so we did a lot of living abroad. We lived in Jamaica, we lived in Norway. We also moved around in the United States, so from D.C. to Cleveland to Ohio to Connecticut. And in many ways I had a good childhood. But I think I was born very sensitive and I just had a lot of anxiety, like from the beginning. And I even remember being really young and being in Jamaica and just like a lot of fear as a young child. Like little things would scare me, like spiders on the wall, or just different ways that I would respond. And I think there was some attachment issues. I think there was things that just kind of propelled some of my anxiousness. And depression too, because on my mom's side there's depression, and so I think I've swung back and forth between feeling anxious and then feeling depressed and a sense of hopelessness at times, and a certain maybe dark place that I would go. And so when I was in my late teens, I started drinking.
I think it is so important to have the ability to not look at the entire picture, the finish line, to look at what's the next puzzle piece that I can fit together. What's the next best step that I can take to nurture and support myself? I remember so distinctly when I was in the process of my memories coming back and the nightmares, and I would wake up in the middle of the night just screaming and sweating and not understanding. And I remember one night waking up from a dream, and all of a sudden it was like sitting up in my bed and saying, community. Community helps us heal. I think if you can find support by being able to confide in someone else, support groups. I think that's why AA works, or Al-Anon. You have a place in which you can confide in others that have shared your journey, that have shared your experience. And when we start to disassemble all that shame that lives within us, that keeps us hostage, that keeps us holding our secrets, then we take the first courageous step into healing.
Most of us have learned to move away from our feelings. And the more you move away from them, the more you try to get over it. I should be over it by now. Happened a year ago. Why aren't I over it? The minute you try and do that, it's like if you were ill with an open wound inside, and then it healed over, but you didn't deal with the wound. It just festers and festers. It does not heal without attention. So people need to learn to move towards their feelings, to embrace them with deep love and compassion, to bring in spiritual help, because frankly, you cannot really deal with it without that source of love and compassion. They need to learn to reach out to others. One of the best ways of healing any kind of trauma is to be held with love.
I love Margaret's closing thought. After many months of isolation during the pandemic, I think the power of a simple, unconditional embrace is more important than ever. Humans thrive on love and compassion. Whether it's a mother's commitment to letting her infant feel safe after a traumatic birth, or a significant other's willingness to create a safe space where we could come to terms with our trauma. It's that type of compassion that allows us to heal ourselves. Let's review some of the important highlights from what we just saw. Trauma can create a dissociative experience and lead to suppressed memories. Unresolved physical trauma literally changes the way we behave. Victims of abuse often abandon themselves and pick up where their abusers left off. Moving away from recognizing our trauma lets the pain fester. There's a connection between self-destructive behavior and physical trauma. Childhood trauma recovery is a long process. Don't try to sprint for the finish line. Make small moves towards it instead. Community is everything. Surround yourself with people who understand and support your journey. Move towards your feelings and embrace them with love and compassion.
There's a powerful link between addiction and trauma, especially physical trauma. The feelings that follow a physical assault or violation range from sadness, anger, fear, shame, and blame. It's an emotional roller coaster.
People spend years on that roller coaster before they realize it's not the only ride in the park. Once they get off, it can take a while to get your balance back.
The longer we live with unresolved trauma, the more our mind, body, and nervous system accept it as normal behavior, and the harder it becomes to change.
And the longer we use short-term methods to cope with our pain, the harder it is to confront and heal our trauma. Again, we're talking about survival. When you're in pain, the first thing you do is try to stop it. If you're coping with drugs or alcohol or unhealthy relationships, you enter a vicious cycle where the body almost becomes immune to your treatment. It requires more, and that's when addiction can take control of your life. Here's Nick with the stories of physical trauma, chronic pain, and healthy solutions.
It's important to remember that trauma is a relative experience. Patricia's story is one of unimaginable pain, betrayal, and suffering. By comparison, Adriana's life might seem idyllic, but like Patricia, she found herself coping with her pain in an unhealthy way, totally unaware of the why behind it. Let's explore what brought them out of the fog and onto a path of healing.
So I became pregnant at the age of 16. And at the time, I didn't even know how you became pregnant. We didn't talk about it. And here, mind you, I had already been sexually abused for 13 years and yet had no idea how my body worked or how you became pregnant.
I was really actually opposed to drinking, but I thought it was stupid. I thought people acted, why would you want to make a fool of yourself when I saw people drinking? But when I had my first drink, it felt like a revelation. It felt like, oh, wow, this is what I've been missing this whole time. It was a match for my nervous system, my sensitivity. It was a match for my insecurity or that feeling of like being even like separate, like it somehow made me feel more connected, to life, to others, and it calmed everything down. So that became a coping mechanism. I was like, okay, well, if I can drink, then it's easier to go out and meet people. If I can drink, I can relax better when I'm by myself. If I can drink, then, it just can even fuel creative work, because I already had started landing into my creative life as a photographer and mixed media artist. So that to me was like I was kind of off and running with my drinking career, and that lasted for about 7 years. And for me, it was really, again, like a coping mechanism, but it also was an escape from reality, right? It was like another escape. And my artist life and my drinking life and that identity that I had around it was really compelling for me.
My parents at the time, we were living in California, they shipped me away to an all-girls school in Provo, Utah. And when I was there, my parents had set up a family for me to meet, to adopt my child. I met the family and kind of things were all set in place. And when it was time for me to give birth to my son, I begged my parents to come back home so I didn't have to go through that alone. Mind you, I was a 16-year-old girl, not really understanding what was about to happen. I didn't have a partner sitting by my side, loving me and supporting me through that. And so my parents acquiesced and allowed me to come back home to give birth to my son. And I had told them at the time I couldn't give him up for adoption. There was no way that I could do that. And when I gave birth to him, I had some medical complications, and I got rushed into emergency surgery after he was born. And when I came out, there was a family standing there holding my child, ready to take him away. And I told my parents, I'm not doing this. I'd rather live on the streets, but you're not taking my child. And so finally they agreed that I could come home with my son, and I had my son for 9 months with me. Breastfed this child, nurtured him, loved him, watched him grow up, and this little infant. And one day my parents said, the leader of the church would like to see you. He, has asked to meet with you. And when I went to see him, he said, I've had a vision from God, and God has told me that this child should no longer be on this earth with you. Maybe at one point he'll come to know you as his mother, but now isn't the time. And at 9 months old, my child was then given up for adoption.
What role does a traumatic experience play in our decision-making and within our day-to-day lives?
What happens to the body, to the mind, kind of in a way to our system, is that it takes that information and organizes it in a series of dysfunctional functioning afterwards. So how do I remember that experience? I remember it because of something that I do later. I remember it because of some place that I've been. I remember it because of some person that I'm with or a story related to it. And as a result, I develop kind of systems to cope with that trauma.
I just felt like it was my little secret, even though I would go out with friends and I felt like everybody, drank around me, but I didn't have a problem. I had a lot of people that seemed to maybe have some addiction issues, but I felt like for me it was all right. So I was living in Minneapolis, and then I decided through a variety of things that happened to move to San Francisco. And I was here for about maybe 6 months. And the Rodney King riots happened. So that was really, that to me was like the first. It was almost the first that really was public. The Rodney King riots came out of Rodney King being assaulted and beaten up and, by police. And there was just such a huge reaction down in Los Angeles, but it spilled up here to San Francisco. And there was a curfew. So I was out drinking. There was a curfew. You weren't supposed to leave the house after, I think it was 11 o'clock. And I didn't follow that because I didn't follow a lot of rules at the time, So I decided to go home, and it was a little after 11, and I had my bike, and I rode home. And I was living in the Mission in San Francisco at the time, and the Mission was very different than it is now. It was not necessarily safe to be out in the Mission at night, in addition to the fact that it was this curfew. So I was at my door, and I was drunk, I wasn't blasted, but I was buzzed, and I couldn't get my key in the door. And I was then taken by 2 men from behind, and they beat me up, and they stole my bike. And they released me, and then I went back inside and was able to get the key in the door. But it was this moment where I thought I could die in this moment. I really felt like I didn't know what was going to happen. I felt incredibly out of control. I left my body, and it was just such a shock to happen all of a sudden. And what resulted from that was a post-traumatic stress response.
Recently I had to have a full hysterectomy. I had to have my ovaries, my uterus removed. And I realized that the trauma of my childhood had stored in my body. The trauma of having my baby, my son, taken from my arms. I took that, and inside me started to harbor the trauma, the illness, the sickness. And going through that experience, I believed it was in that moment that if we take all of this on, and if I hold all this in, what's going to happen to my body? It was my wake-up call of the only way to go through this is to get it out. And the more that we can do that, the way that healing can really come to us. And I think that that's my mission in life.
I felt very unsafe in the world. I started drinking more, but drinking wasn't helping me feel better. And even the next day, actually, I was volunteering at a photography gallery. And there was an event, and I came, and I had this big black eye, and they're like, "What are you doing here? You just had this happen." And there were two women that ran the gallery, and they had a sense that maybe from that experience, it's almost like I think they saw me differently, and they started helping me and suggesting maybe I could go to therapy, and maybe I could consider this and get some support. And so there was something that happened between my roommate, who was sober, who actually took care of me the rest of that night, and these women at this photography gallery, that they could see that I needed help, and that it was connected to the fact that I was assaulted, but it was also connected to the fact that there was something bigger going on that was connected to my drinking. So so that was the catalyst. And in recovery, the world of recovery, that people call it the moment of clarity. And so for me, that moment where I thought, well, I could lose my life here, it woke something up in me, as well as it also put my nervous system, my whole being, into a state of shock. So it was really hard to manage life and function. And it sort of propelled me into I already had been feeling incredibly dysfunctional, but it was like this other level that showed itself, that appeared. So to me, that was the beginning of my own healing journey.
You've been through so much sexual abuse, teen pregnancy, addiction, and then a hysterectomy. How does one absorb this, and how do you move it forward?
I think of it kind of as, a computer with all these tabs open, and you have all of this running in the background, and you have no idea why you're operating the way you are without knowledge that you have all of this in the background constantly consuming time and space in your brain, in your mind, in your thoughts, in your body. You don't understand why you're acting in ways of numbing, or all the different things of depression or anxiety or addictions or food or alcohol or sex or whatever you're doing to try to just manage what's going on. And that experience, it was kind of like, here's everything that's been operating. And now's an opportunity to see it, bring it forth, and start to close those tabs one by one, and give you that clarity and freedom and that calm and stillness back in your life.
If you're already struggling with anxiety and depression, you're somebody who experiences stress at a higher rate and doesn't even have a clinical issue, you're much more likely to feel the effects, not just in the short term, but in the long term with trauma. So what has really changed for me in these 30 years is that I'm seeing a broader spectrum of issues that people are struggling to recover from because they already have anxiety, depression, autism, OCD, other things that make it harder to get through these big traumatic and small traumatic events.
Thank you for sharing your personal experience of trauma. You've obviously been through so much. Is there anything else that you want to share?
Last year, I lost my sister. She died to an overdose. She and I endured the same trauma in our childhood. In high school, she too got pregnant, but had an abortion. And her path was through drugs. And she was addicted to drugs and in and out of rehab facilities. And mine was work and perfectionism. If no one could see what happened to me, then I'll be okay. And I remember the day before she died, we had a conversation, and it was the first time she and I ever spoke of our abuse together. It was the first time we ever shared our common secret that we were sexually abused together. It was the first time we ever had that conversation. Our abuse took her life. And it was in that moment I decided that I would take my business acumen and all of the years of healing that I've done and make a change in people's lives and help them heal. Because I'll be damned if I lose another loved one, because we're not able to tell our stories, because we're not able to use our voices in a way for good. And so for me, telling my story, there's something so powerful in being able to say, I am a survivor and I can go from surviving to thriving.
I did end up going to therapy and did that for a while, and she helped me uncover, really mainly I just came and complained about, I had this person I was dating and they weren't treating me right, or, I didn't have enough money and I couldn't deal with my job, and then I got fired from my job. All these things were happening still because of my drinking. And so she helped me come to the realization that, stopping drinking and getting sober could be a good solution for me. And so at 24, I got sober.
Every day, I work with people who've had some pretty awful traumatic events, who it really became their pivot moment for way greater things in their lives. Through their trauma, they found their greater purpose, and they realized that that traumatic event, after processing it and dealing with it and putting it where it needed to be, which was behind them in a healthy way, there's so many people who have, turned that dial and said, I'm not going to let trauma define me. And in fact, I'm going to use it as a way to better myself. And so many people with trauma also have used it as a way to help other people. Like, how many healers have had trauma after dealing with it go on to make such a difference in so many people's lives? So, that takes work to have that. And when you have had a traumatic event, you need to have time to grieve whatever happened, to deal with it, get the help. There's lots of great providers helping people in the mental health space with trauma. And when people do that work, they really can move to this other level where it becomes an empowering event in their life.
So that was the first. That's like the first big event really in my life was getting sober. And starting to unravel and unwind a lot of that anxiety and have a community of people. I embraced a community of people through 12-step programs that got it, and that could really embrace me where I was at and help me learn a different way to cope with life without going to drinking. Everything we experience in life influences who we are, where we are in the future. There are some traumas, most traumas, you don't want to ever experience. But you can ask somebody and they'll say that experience helped me to see the world in a different way. And I'm appreciative of this new vision. Or even what I went through was so scary, but seeing how other people responded and showed up for me reminded me that I matter. And I had forgotten that. And so what do I want to take from that? I don't want to take that trauma with me. I want to take the response with me. I want to take this idea that not only do I matter, but I have a community that cares. And in order to sustain that community, what do I need to do? How can I give back? I've had a lot of people who have gone through trauma say, this is a really a good opportunity for me to give back. I want to give back. There's something so incredibly empowering about giving back. One of the ways I'll talk to somebody who's struggling with being on the receiving end after going through a painful experience is I say, think of it as a banking system. Right now you're going to withdraw, but later you can make a deposit. Later you can give something back. And that's an empowering way to be in a vulnerable receiving place. And so there is that, you never knew how hard this situation was going to be, and you never wanted to learn, but now you know. Maybe you'll be able to give something to somebody to help them through that difficult time.
We know how much your story of pain and perseverance can help others. What would be your message to others going through a similar healing process?
My message is that you can get through this. You can get to the other side of it. And it's not easy. And one thing that I have learned is this ability for radical self-love. And I think if you can find a way within yourself to find your lovability, to find that sweet little girl that just wants to be wrapped in your arms, that to me has been the greatest gift through my healing journey, and just one step at a time. And there's oftentimes now, being on the other side of it, I often think to myself, I can't believe I'm still living. I can't believe I made it through that. I look back and it's like looking at the war of what happened and thinking, oh my gosh, I made it. I made it to the other side, and it is possible. Not only did I just endure sexual abuse, it was physical abuse, it was emotional abuse, it was abandonment and being detached from your child. It was almost as if he died. And I think something that I also want to say is that if someone were watching this, it does not take the magnitude of my trauma to still have negative effects. It can take one account of being sexually abused. And so how we process trauma is different for everyone as well, right? I mean, I have been given the gift of resilience. It's my superpower, so thank you for that, because I think that we all have to find that within us, of that next thing that just keeps us tethered to getting to the other side.
It's easy to watch Patricia there at the end and see her as some type of superhero after everything she's been through. But that resilience she displays was earned. That's the result of years of hard and difficult work. Making sense of physical trauma and understanding how to cope is the core of post-traumatic growth. It doesn't happen in an instant, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Here are some key things to remember about resilience in the face of chronic pain. You are likely to experience a wide range of feelings and reactions to physical trauma. It can take a long time to recover and move past the event and focus on the fallout. You are a survivor, already bigger than your physical trauma. Recognize the good in yourself. There's a lot there. Give yourself time to grieve, time to forgive, then move on to the healing. Victims of childhood abuse need to know that every person needs and is worthy of love. Trauma is a pivot point in life, providing opportunity for growth. Healing often leads to a desire to help others avoid the pain you once carried. The journey towards healing starts with you, but you don't have to do it in the dark. Our experts are here to guide you through your traumatic healing, and we are blessed to have them. This series gives you unprecedented access to their wisdom and insights. Subscribing to Whole TV also gives you access to the full uncut interviews and a special companion piece packed with powerful science, wisdom, and insight, all designed to help you navigate your way toward overcoming your trauma. Please take a moment to subscribe now so you can have access to this information and all of the bonus resources available for this limited time. Fitness, yoga, self-care, masterclasses, and much more will keep coming your way, all designed to support your betterment. Join Whole TV now and get a deep discount with an annual plan. Thank you. I'm not gonna lie, this was a hard episode, but it proves that there's hope and healing right around the corner for us all.
Not just healing, but power. When a person can look in the mirror with love and confidence and say, I am a survivor, that's power.
To me, it's humbling.
Yeah, agreed. I'm in awe of what a dedicated human can do.
Up until now, we've been exploring personal trauma and ways to work through it.
For the most part, this involves the individual, a therapist, and possibly family members. But what about traumas that affect mass amounts of people?
In our next episode, we're going to explore societal trauma, the pain and damage that's done when a social system fails to care for or protect individuals.
Feels like we could all use some of this right now, especially nowadays.
I think it's going to be very enlightening. We'll see you then.
Bye for now.